in and seeing what apps they have installed. And if there's something you don't recognize, then you should ask them about it and have them explain it to you. Same with online accounts. One of the things when our kids were growing up, it was not enough that we had to be their friends, but we actually had to have their login information, because there's things you can see as someone logging in that's different from what you can see as a friend. And of course, that changed as they got older, but part of it is explaining to the kids that they need to build a reservoir of trust and responsibility as part of using these devices. Big thing is talking with friends and other parents. Some of you may remember back in 1996, which was well before social media, Secretary of State Clinton, back then she was First Lady, Hillary Clinton, wrote a book called It Takes a Village. There was a huge kerfuffle about whether or not that was an actual African proverb or where it came from, blah, blah, blah. But it became a big deal. And so, she got both a lot of congratulations, but then also a lot of criticism for basically what people were saying was a socialistic approach. In all reality, in this day and age, we all live in a global village. That's the thing. And so there really is a need to coordinate with other people in your child's life in order to help keep them safe. So talking to your friends about what are their internet rules, what are your child's friends' permissions or rights, what kind of games are in the house, so on and so forth. It gets, it can be a little bit complicated, but it's a great way to start those conversations. And then, of course, for parents, one of the ongoing things is to be an advocate for good policies, for making sure that the schools are doing everything that they can to make sure that things are safe, voting for representatives who actually care about child safety. And, it's an ongoing battle in the United States where you've got the telecommunication firms and the online service providers with enormous lobbying resources, and they're flooding Capitol Hill with dollars. And it's hard for people who advocate for child safety to have the same voice. And so to the extent that parents can try to push back on that as parents, that can make a big difference. Okay, protecting children at school. This has been an area that I've really dived into for the last 5 years. And maybe a little bit before that when I was on the school board, but especially with Cyber Traps for Educators. Huge key here is cyber safety education. And when we talk about that, we're talking about both parents and students. So with parents, one of the things that schools do that I think is really important is at the start of each school year, they do handouts on cyber safety issues that go home with the kids. There's also a number of schools that will run information nights. I've spoken at a bunch of these where you go in and you do this kind of cyber safety presentation and then throw it open for questions, that kind of thing. But schools are such a good place to sponsor that. With students, I think one of the keys is to weave cyber safety into the curriculum. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. It's part of politics, it's part of a little bit of history now, particularly for kids who have grown up with this. It can be digital citizenship, on and on and on. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. But I think one of the things, although that is really useful to think about, is that we're trying to play the long game here, that if we can teach this generation of kids the concepts of cyber safety, in the process, we'll be raising a generation of cyber safety parents. And that's the goal, is to really fold this into society on an ongoing basis. We're playing catch up as adults, right? And particularly gray-haired adults. We're really trying to keep up the speed with all of this. But we have this brilliant opportunity to help this up and coming generation make it second nature to them. And that is really, I think, what motivates me, because I want these kids to get to a point where they don't even need to think about it as parents, that we've changed society to that extent. Again, with schools, if you see something, say something. Critical to have schools be at the forefront of this. And related to that, and this is something that has been a fairly big push in the US recently, is this idea of training educators to recognize signs of grooming or abuse. And if anybody wants any information on this, just let me know, because I've got some good resources. But there are very specific things that educators can be trained to look for, so that if there's a potential problem, they can let someone know. Connected to that is having IT, information technology policies, that will facilitate this, both in terms of recognizing potential problems and also protecting kids. For instance, within the schools, if you're using an archived email system, do you have filters that will alert administrators if there's some kind of language that suggests potential abuse? Do the IT filters block access to materials that kids shouldn't see? What are the policies for that? Is there an acceptable use policy for the school, for the teachers, for the kids? Is that information provided to parents so that they can talk to the school about their concerns and understand what the school is doing? And then one other thing that is, I think, useful, particularly in the United States, is that from a legal perspective, there are what we refer to as mandatory reporting requirements, which basically provide in each of the 50 states that if anyone sees suspected child abuse of one kind or another, and all of the definitions are a little bit different, but if anybody sees that, if anybody who is identified as a mandatory reporter sees that, they have to report that information to law enforcement. And where the regional flavors come into play is that different states will make different types of people mandatory reporters. But one of the things that is consistent in all 50 states is that teachers, who typically, prior to COVID, would spend 6 to 10 hours a day with kids, in every state, they're listed as mandatory reporters. And it's a really, really important tool for minimizing the potential abuse of children. And obviously, physical abuse is probably the most common situation, but there's also training for teachers on signs that a child is engaged or is being harassed or groomed online as well. So there's a lot of different pieces to that. Okay, children online. We've got a couple of more groups here. We're going to talk about corporations, and then we're going to talk about governments as being partners in dealing with this. So, corporate responsibility, and this idea of being involved in the creation of the tech tools, I thought was really interesting, because that's an ongoing issue. And I think the one thing that is perhaps hopeful is that there is a constant turnover in the tools that are used online. And so I think that as we go forward into this tech future, there remains enormous opportunity in terms of creating the next generation of tools. My hope and argument would be that we need to get the businesses that create those tools to make child welfare and safety a central part of the design process. It has to be from the ground up, because when you've got someone like a Facebook, when you've got a service like a Facebook or a Twitter trying to retroactively adopt child safety, it's extraordinarily hard to do. It just doesn't work well. And the thing about, those two services, I'll give them a little bit of a pot shot right now, because both of those services are designed or actually have a rule that say you can't use them if you're 13 or younger. And yet, there are literally millions of children with Twitter and Facebook accounts under the age of 13. Now, that's a failure on a couple of different levels. It's a failure on the part of the tech companies to come up with a way to effectively do age gates for kids. But then also, to some degree, it goes back to the parents who don't necessarily enforce these rules as well as they should, or in some cases, actually help their underage children get accounts for a whole host of reasons, none of which I fully understand. Tech companies should be at the forefront of cyber safety campaigns for their users and for parents. There should be an effective partnership between these companies and parents around the world. And to the extent that the company is allowing people to play at all ages in their resource, they have a special responsibility to make sure that kids stay safe. We've already talked about baking into the design. Here's a big one, which is that if you have a gaming service in particular, you presumably, if you're a reasonably responsible company, you presumably have a bunch of rules and regulations regarding online behavior, language, grooming, harassment, cyberbullying, all the rest of that. That's meaningless unless you enforce it, unless there's some mechanism to protect kids. A great example is Fortnite, which has had some really nasty cyberbullying scandals recently, because even though their terms of service say you will not bully, they don't have enough people to actually prevent the bullying from happening. Similarly, I got interviewed the other day for a story about the fact that some of these games like Minecraft and Fortnite actually have the ability for people to create adult-only spaces within the games. But the problem is that they don't enforce that they're adults only. So you've got kids stumbling across this content that people have created anywhere in the world, and they shouldn't be seeing that. They shouldn't be subjected to the harassment that occurs when they go into those spaces. At the end of the day, corporations need to either affirmatively themselves figure out how to enforce their rules and protect children, or we need to figure out some mechanism from a legislative or regulatory point of view to make that happen. Because the potential risk to children is significant. And I think one of the things I can say with some confidence is, there's a lot of advantages to games, but compared to, the information and educational resources, if we need to limit or slow down the games a little bit, that may not be as great of a loss in kind of societal sense. Lastly, part of the enforcement piece of this is that games need to be very proactive and effective in dealing with or cooperating with law enforcement in terms of investigations, identifying users who may be grooming children or harassing them or what have you, and making sure that they preserve information for the purposes of digital investigation. And those are, I think, just absolute requirements if you're running some kind of online service, because the potential, particularly when you're blending ages, as these games do, the potential for abuse is significant. And when I say that, I say that from the sense of almost, even one case being too many. I do think we should reflect upon the fact that in actual numbers, the percentage is extraordinarily small of serious events, of serious attacks on children. But even if we're talking a 10th or 100th of a percent, that can be a significant real life number given the size of these communities and the size of the online services. So, I don't want to come off as alarmist, and I also, and I usually start off by saying this, I'm extraordinarily tech positive. I think there's fantastic resources available to us all, but I've talked to too many people who have been the victims of online harm, and they don't deserve to go through that. We need to stop that as much as we can. So that's the tension that we're constantly grappling with. I like this idea, and actually I was listening to Venkat earlier. I wrote a book called American Privacy, which was kind of a biography of the right to American privacy. And I go into this work from the point of view of someone who profoundly believes in privacy and in the ability of people to control the distribution of their personal information. So I absolutely agree that we cannot kill the internet just over this issue of child protection. That to me seems utterly backwards. The real goal here is to reform the internet and to reform the services we use so that we really can have the best of both worlds, which is safe children on the one hand and privacy and educational resources on the other. It's a tough goal, but I continue to believe we can do it. Okay, last piece here, protecting children as citizens. Number one, cyber safety education campaigns. Governments, to a varying degree, do some interesting work in this regard. Again, another shout out to New Zealand, who I think has been particularly proactive in this area. But if anybody would like to have links to some of the US resources, just let me know. There are some good things that are out there. Adequate resources to promote child safety. This is a budgetary item. I love the shout out to where's the money going to? Where are all of these resources that are flowing from this phenomenal goldmine that is online technology? There is more than enough money just in Bezos's pocket, at Amazon, to do a better job with online child safety. And we need to figure out ways to pressure governments to provide those resources up and down the scale. Reaching out to non-governmental organizations that work with parents and children. Somebody was talking about homeless children and kids, living on the street. We've got enormous challenges in terms of differentiated access for the disabled. Schools need more resources. We need to do a better job of redirecting our funds to places that actually lift up kids and will make the next generation safer. Legislation and regulations designed to protect children online. I've worked on a couple of the things here in the United States. There was the Child Online Protection Act. There's the Child Online Privacy Protection Act. There was the Communication Decency Act, which actually really got my writing career started back in '96. That mostly got overturned. There's a lot of things you can do out there to make it safer for kids, both in terms of privacy protection, getting information from children, but then also in terms of the criminal laws, right? So there's both the civil piece and the criminal, making sure that we have well-articulated laws that punish people who do harassment, sexual assault online, so on and so forth. As I said, coordination. Governments should be good at this, at bringing people together, coming up with the best suite of ideas on how to move forward on these concepts. And then lastly, you need effective law enforcement, unfortunately, that if something goes wrong online, you need organizations that are capable of doing often extraordinarily complex digital investigations. You need good prosecutors who can actually bring the cases to court. And then hopefully the ability to explain to juries exactly what's going on so that they can protect kids. And that leaves us at this, Q&A.
Right. Thank you much, Fred.
My pleasure.
There has been a lot in,
Yes.
in this conversation. I've got a couple of pointers here to reiterate before we get into the Q&A. Insufficient supervision, yes, is a problem, and the fact that the digital divide is such that the device becomes the babysitter at the time mommy or daddy has a space to do other things. So
Yes.
that is a source of concern. Multiplicity of access points, yes, that is there. You switch them from one platform and they are doing the other. But like you said, communication plays a very critical role in all of this. And the children's participation in the decision making is very important. I like the way you put it this way, cultivating the culture of communication with, in fact, I've underlined with children and their peers. And I think that that's one thing we should all take home from here. And participation invests in children the sense of responsibility on how the device is used. So,
Yes.
of course, engaging them, make it easier for them to appreciate the device they are using, the world in which they are engaging with, in order to get it right. So talking to the child is very, very important. And we have the acronym TEAMS for it. Talk, engage, agree, manage, and secure the space
That's
together.
nice.
Well, whilst I pick maybe those who might be putting up their hands in the room, the first thing I would want you to throw a bit of light on
Yes.
is there a module for us to use to help students understand the impact of technology, so that from the very beginning of engaging with the device, they know that it's important they connect and disconnect. So we could manage the issue of too much screen time, addiction, and all the nuances that they may encounter. Is there something like that? Have you done anything like that?
Well, I have a
The
treat.
second thing I would also like to know from your experience is whether school boards have really played a key role in the design of school policies. If that is the case, do we need a school-specific policy, or we would want to have a district policy which will cut across the schools within that district, which is actually being informed by research or something? Can you throw a bit of light on that for us before I move to the next set of questions?
Well, so two things for you. You'll be pleased to know that I have a PDF of a little book that I wrote called Raising Cyber Ethical Children. And it really gets specifically into the device usage things. And I'd be happy to share that with you. You could send it to whoever might be interested.
Right. That'd be cool.
And I think that, it's hard. My advice to younger parents is easier, which is to say, get the children used to the idea of device limitations as they're growing up. And then it's less of a fight. The real problem is when you run into a situation where the child is in their teen years and you're trying to pull back now because there may be some school issue or whatever, and the child is extraordinarily resistant. And that's much, much harder. With respect to your second question, when I was on the school board, we did have district-wide acceptable use policies that set the standard for the entire district. But then we would sometimes have specific policies for individual buildings because they had different issues. And so we would draw on sample policies from around the United States. And there's a ton of material that's out there in terms of what makes sense, what kind of language. One of the things that's challenging is that it's a little bit of a balance between social and educational and legal concerns, because they all come into play in one way or another. Yeah.
So in terms of that, in this current dispensation, this is just my thinking. You could tell me whether I'm wrong or right. It is not right to just have an elder in a school management board, but it's appropriate to have an elder with an expertise in the board to kind of help guide the process when it comes to school policy design and implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I
would.
think you'd want somebody with technical experience, right? Who understands how the technology works. And it's also, I think, useful, and we did this on the school board, that we had a couple of student members. They couldn't vote, obviously, on policies and things like that. But when we were discussing things like acceptable use policy and the use of technology in schools, they could talk. I mean, they contributed to the conversation. So it was a great perspective to have. So I think, you know, to the extent that it's practical, the more voices you bring to the table, the better off we are.
Right. Can you give us a background to cyber traps for the young, as well as cyber traps for educators?
Yes, I can.
I'm asking that because it will be good for us to have an insight into what went into the design and development of those resources,
Yes.
and to see how it can inform our basic process, because we want to raise digital citizens, digital leaders in the space. But without the character education, it will be very difficult to do. So as parents, if the cyber traps for educators or for the young, or even for mom and dad, will be of help, I would love to promote that, so that when we read it, we get informed and then we can make good decisions at the end of the day.
Well, I
So
appreciate
kindly
that.
walk us through the works.
Absolutely. So cyber traps for the young was an idea that I had, was about 7-8 years ago, because I was just getting off of the school board, and my boys were ranging in age at that point from 19 to 12. So they were, you know, kind of in the real thick of using social media and online games and so forth. And I wanted to look at the issue of what kind of trouble kids were getting into online, because it seemed to me that kids were using more and more devices, laptops, computers, and so forth. And remember, right around 2011, 2012, the iPhone had been out for about 3 or 4 years. So you were starting to see more kids using smartphones. And it was right around that time that the word sexting became popular. And I was just absolutely bewildered at the idea that kids would be taking these photos of themselves and sharing them with their friends. And so it seemed to me like there was a good opportunity to write a book, letting parents know what some of the risks were. And so when you read through Cyber Traps for the Young, you'll see that I organized it around different kinds of risks that parents might face. And the unfortunate thing was that when I was working on that book, I realized that there were a number of instances in which kids had gotten into trouble with teachers because of these devices. And of course, I had just gotten off the school board. So now it occurred to me that the next book to do was, what are the risks that teachers face as a result of using these devices? And most of them, of course, have to do with relationships with kids of one kind or another. In this new version of Cyber Traps for Educators, basically, I write about 25 different cyber traps that teachers face. And then, it's built around this idea of ethics. What kind of ethical questions should teachers be asking themselves about how to avoid getting into trouble? What is appropriate interaction online with kids? What kinds of personal information should they put out on social media? How does that influence their ability? And so that was that book. And that actually has been really good because it's been the bulk of my work over the last 5 years, traveling around to schools, departments of education, that kind of thing, talking about these cyber traps issues for educators. Just real quickly, the last book, The Expecting Moms and Dads, it just seemed to me that if I had talked about kids and then I had talked about teachers, then what about the start of one? And that was what I wanted to do. And it turns out that there are a surprising number of technical issues and cyber traps around pregnancy and newborns. So, like I was talking about, the idea of co-opting your newborn's identity by posting online. But what about, are you invading their privacy if you put their sonogram on Facebook? Or are you releasing medical information? Should you register your baby's domain name so that they can have their own website when they grow up? There's a bunch of different topics that I go into. So anyway, from my perspective, this is all about the unforeseen consequences of using technology. And that's really what the Cybertrap series is aimed at. My goal is just to get people thinking about these devices that we use constantly and start to really appreciate that they can have some really really unfortunate impacts if we don't think about what we're doing. That's all.
Okay. So, what is the role of the ICT sector in all of this? It may sound like quite a stupid question, but I think that if we have it spelled out clearly, that this is expected of the ICT sector, then everybody here, having seen something online, will know that, okay, this is what I'm supposed to demand from my service providers, so long as I'm paying for the service. So it shouldn't be one size fits all, but then a curated service that will suit my need and my interest, what I'm paying for. The other thing is, if I get the inspiration for writing the cyber traps for educators correctly, it means that it could help educators help and design their own ethical frameworks.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Let me start with that one first, because the thing about this initiative in the United States called the Model Code of Ethics for Educators is that the teaching profession in the United States does not have a code of ethics the way lawyers do, or doctors, or physicians. And so a good friend and colleague of mine has been leading the effort to develop a code of ethics. And you put your finger on it exactly. The point of cyber traps for educators is, especially now with this new version, is to get teachers thinking about the ethics of using devices, which is to say, their classrooms are surrounded by devices, and there's a huge push, particularly now with the pandemic, to do distance and remote learning. But because teachers are using these devices so much, it raises a host of ethical issues that they need to think about. And there's probably no profession that spends as much uninterrupted time with children as teaching. And that, I think, it can lead to the development of wonderful relationships. We all have had teachers who were hugely influential in our lives. But the reality is, and there are unique aspects of technology that make it worse. The reality is that there's some risk there in terms of how these devices facilitate inappropriate relationships. And then just beyond that, there's the potential embarrassment that we can all face with electronic devices of one kind or another. So there is all of that. With respect to your first question, can you restate that?
Sorry?
With respect to the first point you raised.
Yes, I was talking about the role of the ICT sector.
Yes,
in
that's right.
promoting online safety and kind of serving the interest of the greater public.
Yeah, I think that we need to have a phase shift that embraces the idea that people who are paying for this service can tailor it more to their needs. And it's a little bit challenging. I mean, there are different legal and cultural elements to this. It's very challenging in the United States because of the First Amendment to the Constitution, which provides that the government shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And so it makes it very hard to impose regulation on the ICT sector to limit access to material, which means really that the only option is to have the marketplace do it. And so far, at least, there hasn't been enough demand for better tailored experiences. Ideally, what you'd be talking about is the ability of parents to go to their ICT provider and say, this is the list of content that I do not want. And so, make sure that this does not come into my household. That's a fairly challenging thing from a technical point of view, and there's no perfect system. But the ICT sector could, I think, be working harder at it than it may be.
Okay. You know what happened? I lost you at the time you gave the pointers for the ICT sector. So the last bit was what I've just heard. So could you help me again with what you said so that if there need be for a follow-up question, I could pose that to you, please?
Okay. So basically, I'll try to restate what I was saying, which is the idea that in the United States, we have the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which provides, among other things, that the government shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, which limits the ability of the government to impose regulations on what speech can be distributed.
Okay.
What that means, though, is that the only force really that can get the ICT sector to behave differently is the marketplace. And so far, at least, that hasn't really happened yet. And ideally, we would get to a point where a parent could go to their service provider and say, I want a checklist of things that I either do or do not want coming into the house. And you provide me only those things. So for instance, if they didn't want adult content or if they didn't want things that were too violent, there'd be a way to filter those. Now you can use software to do that on a computer by computer basis, but it's more difficult with mobile devices and so forth. So anyway.
All right. Thank you on that particular one. Sure. Maybe before I'll pose my last question, which will be more on digital character development for young people. Yes. The floor is open. Whoever has a question for Fred could put up the hand or show the hand, then we could allow you or give you the opportunity to ask the question. Any questions so far? Anybody?
Yes.
Right. You have the
So
floor.
I have a question, please.
Okay, please go ahead.
So, firstly, thank you, Ao, for this opportunity, and thanks to Frederick also for this great webinar presentation. So, my name is Abdi Jalil Bashar. I am coming from Chad. I'm the president of NGO called House of Africa. So, we still work in ICT and children protection. So, my question is that about Frederick, you talk about safety education campaign. So, in this point, because it's very important for us, because now we are trying to be in contact with the National Cybersecurity Agency, so to do this kind of education campaign. So, what is your advice or the good model strategy to do this education? Because for us it's very important, so we need more and more, and yeah, so I need to stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I mean,
thank you, Bacha.
It's a great question. I think that the answer is that it needs to be, I guess the terms I would use is it needs to be multifaceted and it needs to be persistent. And by multifaceted, what I'm really talking about is that you need to think about many different ways of reaching parents, in terms of the information that you want to provide them. There's the vectors, obviously, of handouts for kids at school. There's advertisements that you can do, Facebook pages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I know that we were talking a little bit earlier about this idea about being involved in the creation of things. One of the things that might be really useful is a parent information or child safety app that could be distributed to parents in districts or in your country or what have you. And then I think, the other thing is that I would start coming at it from the ICT perspective, which is to say, reaching out to the CEOs and the CFOs of these companies and saying, there are liability issue here. There are simple moral issues here in terms of protecting our children. We need your help in informing parents about what they should do or what their options are, and make that part of the information packet that is given to parents at sign-up for these devices, whether it's for themselves or for their kids. I mean, obviously, especially if it's for their kids. And there's a whole nother conversation to be had about whether it might be possible to rope the telecommunication companies, the people who actually provide cell numbers to families and to kids, make them part of an age verification system. I have a half-formed thought on that I'm trying to figure out if there's some practical way to implement. But
okay.
But there are tools out there. In terms of the information campaign, though, I think the way to approach it is, how many different vectors can I list? How many different ways of reaching parents can I list? And then, basically rank them from cheapest to most expensive, and just figure out how to put together packets of information. Twitter is obviously good. I do think, as loathsome as Facebook can be sometimes, Facebook pages are a good way to provide static information. Really basic, simple website with a catchy name. The list goes on and on. But it's a little bit like any other kind of marketing. I mean, given how busy parents are, simply trying to tell them once or twice or even a dozen times is not going to do it. It has to be an ongoing, persistent, multi-phase approach to getting the information out. And, again, make the kids allies in some way. Figure out some way for the kids to be part of this educational process, because there's nothing kids like more than teaching their parents things.
All right. I haven't seen any hand up again. I think we have about 10 minutes more to expire. Um, Fred,
Yes.
there is this thing which is going through my mind. What would you call, or what would you say is the best practice when it comes to policy around online safety? You made mention of COPPA,
Mm-hmm.
which you've been part of. Um, what went into that whole work? Because it seems to stand the test of time, and it seems to be informing a lot of initiatives and things around that. Would you recommend that kind of thing for our situation? I've taken note of one thing you said, that we need to have a common front in calling for reforms.
Yes.
Would you advise that we go a policy way as a continent, or what would you advise we do?
Well, I do have to say, that I have found this so educational for me personally today,
Okay.
to understand a little bit more of the regional and national issues that you
Okay.
face, and it's interesting. I love the graphic that you had of the continent as a whole with the faces of the kids. It's just such a beautiful image, and it seems to me that the point that was made earlier about this being the fourth revolution, the fourth kind of growth opportunity in the world, and that it being one that you should not miss, no one should miss,
Okay.
is so apt. And it just seems to me that I guess I would make the argument that if you as a nation or as a continent can get this right in terms of digital safety for children, what it will do to position your children for the coming generation is
Okay.
remarkable. And,
Okay.
and so I think from my perspective, that would be the selling point, is to say that we can put our children on a footing that will really change their direction. And that we do that through effective policy and education and the cooperation of all of these institutions that are involved in our societies. And I know that there are national tensions, are there not, in every part of the world. So I'm
Of
not going to
course.
assume that there's unanimity of anything. But
Yes.
if
Yes.
I mean, this conversation is so hope inspiring because it's organized around this central theme, which is the safety and the growth of our children. And if we can't agree on that I throw up my hands. But I will
All
say
right.
to you, that is such a brilliant organizing principle.
Okay.
And so, ideally, what you do is you sell to the ICT that a safe and well-educated digital citizenry is the best economic investment they can make in the world. And then you say to the governments, a well-organized and well-educated populace is the greatest economic driver you will have. I just think there are so many winning points to this simply by making our children safer.
Okay. Thank you so much, Fred.
Oh, you're welcome.
Do we have Chioma, Chizoba, Chika, Ore, and Sola available? Would you still like to put forward your questions? Chioma? Chizoba. Okay, I don't know if they are still on or they've disconnected. Since I can't couldn't see any more hands up in the room. I would like to hand over, just maybe in case any of the young participants want to ask a question. After Dr. Simon Denchi speaks, you can still ask your question, because we would have to answer your question before we get out of here. So I would like to invite Dr. Simon Denchi to share with us some of the pointers by way of next steps, the way forward, before we try to call it a day. So over to you, Sam.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay, that's great. I think today has been really refreshing, very, very educative, listening to different perspectives from different parts of the world, Africa and the rest, and Europe, and especially in America from Frederick. But summing it all together, I have teased out some points which I have categorized under what children can do themselves, or how children can be empowered, the role of cooperation in this whole exercise, the role of government, the role of schools and educators in this whole process, the role of businesses and developers. When I say developer, I mean those who develop the applications and softwares, and the role of civil society organization and law enforcement. For children, like was discussed, the way forward is to ensure that children are aware of their role in using the online applications. Children must be empowered to use online applications the way they are supposed to use. Children must also be exposed to the harms and dangers of issues online. And Frederick mentioned that we should even do that 3 years before what we anticipate, because they need to be prepared ahead of time. Because it's a very fluid environment. You never know what comes up next. So I think it's a very important point that children should be empowered, they should be exposed, and they should be guided to know their limits online. And I think these are key things that we need to do. And they should also be guided to be able to identify explicit materials and know who to revert to. For some children, when they see explicit material, they may want to talk about it to their friends. But I think it's important to know that I have to talk to my parents or my teachers. All these are important things that children should know. We also need to involve children in this whole discussion. Very often, policy is made without the involvement of those who are the key stakeholders or the focus of the policy. So children should be involved in this whole discussion when we are designing policy. And so I find it very interesting that we have children here. But again, we need to ensure that policymakers involve the children. At that level, if you are not careful, sometimes they are left out. So I think going forward in our advocacy and campaigns, we should ensure that policymakers involve the children and get their perspective when they are designing policy. In terms of parents, one thing that came out was that parents should be on top of their game, especially in terms of ICT. You should know what to control and what your children are looking at. If you are not tech savvy, you might not be able to guide or direct your words properly. Again, parents must ensure that their children are exposed to what they are supposed to, or if you like, the number of hours you are supposed to be online. Frederick mentioned that research shows that if you stay online for long, it affects your ability to be sympathetic. And that was quite striking. If we are going to have a next generation of people who are not going to be sympathetic, you can imagine what society we will be building. So I think that it's important for parents to guide their children properly, adequately. But to do that, they themselves must be educated enough in ICT or in the digital space to be able to do that. We also said that we need to raise awareness for children and equip them on online skills. A child may have access to the internet, but might not know their limits. And like somebody said, they may even enter the wrong age, and so they may be having access to things that they are not required to have access. So all these things need to be discussed. Then we also to co-design programs with children, some of these applications. We need to drum home the point that developers should involve children in the development and design of some of these programs. I don't know how well this is domesticated in Africa. Maybe in other places, they have policy to guide it. But you may see an application for children which might not necessarily involve children the way they are supposed to be involved. So this is another aspect that we need to look at. Then we need a partnership. Fred mentioned cooperation. And they should be what, for example, what we are doing at the continental or global level to ensure that all stakeholders are involved, and also to ensure that we can learn from different environments, their challenges and their experiences to enhance our whole. In terms of children also, we need to involve people with disability. In Africa, we know that they are one of the most marginalized. And the challenge is that if you are not careful, you leave them out in the digital education space. So how can we empower children with disabilities to be able to use the internet the way it's supposed to be used? Now,
you have 30
when you talk
seconds.
about children with disability, you need to also link it to their parents. Sorry?
You have 30 seconds to wind up.
All right. So with children with disability, you need to empower their parents because of the support, the kind of support they need. Their parents need to be empowered to be able to support them also. Given that I have 30 seconds, we need to weave in cybersecurity in the curriculum so that children know this from the start, just like as these days they are taught about the development of their body and what to expect at what age. We also need to integrate this in the curriculum. We also need to train educators to identify early signs so that they can help the children.
Thank you, Dr. Denchi. We would have to put it on hold there because we are running behind schedule. But then before, Chioma, are you ready to speak? Lenana, you asked about the role of tribalism in online safety. If you come across tribally inflamed content online, chances are that you will be affected. So that is the safety aspect of that. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all our speakers for the day. In fact, to thank the Secretary General of Africa Telecommunications Union, Mr. John Omo. I would also like to thank our young participants, Lenana, Alberta, Kwabena, Chioma, Chizoba, Chike, Ore, Sola, and Chris Williams, Dr. Sefako Komashi, Madam Idu Priska Izioma, and Benga Sesan, and Simon. Thank you so much for making time and staying with us throughout this. We believe that to have an Africa Fit for Children, it's important we view our work alongside other works which are done in terms of safeguarding children. So in essence, children should be safeguarded in all spaces, online and offline, because that is where they are found. If the safeguards do not work in that area, it'll be difficult to attain that Africa Fit for Children. On this note, thank you so much. The recordings will be shared with you in your various emails that you registered with. And we will get back to you on the developments and the way forward for other engagements. Thank you, and God bless us all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.